Hello, Matt here. Time for my November Q&A for Patreon. And this month I only have one question, which is from Attila. And that is, "Hi Matt, dropping this here from Discord. Did you ever have a thought to turn this the other way and design a Year Zero maxi?" Now, the conversation, for those of you who know this stuff I've worked on in the past, will probably get what he's referring to, but I've created a product called Year Zero Mini, and that is effectively a rules light role-playing framework to kind of run any kind of game in any setting, so long as it's relatively gritty, because that's really what the Year Zero engine is designed to do. And it's a pretty lightweight system. And it was my kind of answer to Fate Core, which I've had lots of problems with in the past. I kickstarted Fate Core back in the day, played and ran a ton of it, and it never quite clicked for me or my group. And in the end, when I fell in love with the Year Zero engine, I really wanted to do something. I really wanted something similar, which was this like lightweight framework to kind of do your own settings with, and that's what it is. Since I've created Year Zero Mini, I've also created Year Zero Nano, which is kind of an FKR-inspired extreme lightweight hack of Year Zero Mini. And I'm currently developing a game called Stiletto, which is a slightly crunchier take on Year Zero Mini, which I am kind of currently calling Year Zero Light. So everything I'm working on in this regard is like a lightweight iteration of the Year Zero engine. So I know Attila likes crunchier games, especially campaigns. I know he's running Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th Edition, The Enemy Within as well, and really enjoys the crunch that game brings. And yeah, that's where his question comes from. So to answer your question, Attila, have I ever thought about turning it the other way and doing a Year Zero maxi? Well, no, I hadn't until you asked. And now it's one of those things that I just can't stop thinking about, like as an academic exercise almost. And here's how I would do it. So I guess the first thing I would do is I'd take a page from some of the crunchy games that I really enjoy, all of which are D100 based. And I think I would probably be tempted to do something like what Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd Edition does, and that is attributes plus skills plus talents, because that gives a really huge variety of options for the player. Now, this isn't that different for the Year Zero engine games like Forbidden Lands or the extremely crunchy one, Twilight 2000. It's just that Warhammer has a lot more in the way of attributes. I think it has, 2nd edition has 8 attributes from memory, maybe even have more than that. And there's a big skill list, including basic skills and advanced skills. Advanced skills, you have to have at least invested some training into them or some experience into them or have had them at character creation. Otherwise, you can't even attempt them. And the talents just really kind of add tweaks to the underlying system. They give you bonuses to some of your skill tests, that sort of thing. And the attributes can still be rolled on their own as well. So really, it's a nice system. Kind of it's not perfect, especially with combat, but that's probably the starting point I would take, because it's also not that different from the Year Zero engine. So on top of that, I'd be tempted to expand on combat, but I would still want to keep it similar to the Year Zero engine like combat system, because I really like what's been done in the Year Zero engine system for combat. I'm talking with games that have combat rules, not like Tales from the Loop, which doesn't have anything, and not quite like Twilight 2000, because Twilight 2000 is very crunchy, but it also is very hard to keep track of all of the modifiers and things at the table. So I don't think I would do it like that. So it'd be somewhere between sort of I mean, I don't know how I would do it, but I am developing an actual combat system for Stiletto. And I think what I would do, I would quite like how it's come out as well. It's player facing. There's a little bit of crunch to it. There's some decisions that you have to make. And I think I would probably expand on that underlying system for this like Year Zero maxi. I would probably also keep it player facing so that it could be played solo, just because I do enjoy a lot of solo role playing. But yeah, that's the Stiletto I would use as a starting point. And I would look at probably how, if I was to do it, I'd probably look at Twilight 2000, which is extremely crunchy, how it's done in Forbidden Lands, which is also relatively crunchy, in terms of combat, the tactical side of things, and how that's been done. Maybe even Coriolis, because Coriolis was the crunchiest when it came out in terms of combat, and it introduced things like Overwatch to the Year Zero engine system. It had crits on a decent roll rather than only crits only happening when your character is broken, which I also really like because it really amps up the tension. But it kind of, yeah, so maybe something along those lines. And I have actually worked on a Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay hack in the past, like a Year Zero engine hack in the past, which did have a relatively crunchy combat system. I was always struggling with it because it felt like there was too much going on, and I was trying to simplify and streamline. So I might go back and look at what I had done years ago for that and see if there's something I could pull out and kind of polish a little bit. But I wouldn't just be throwing the kitchen sink in there. I would want it to feel streamlined, but also have lots of tactical options. So that's one thing I would also do. I would probably have a big old equipment section. I would probably expand equipment to really have a lot of things like... I'd probably look at something like Edge of the Empire for the Star Wars game, because there's a lot of interesting things going on with the equipment there. There's a lot of equipment. It all feels a little bit different. The problem with that is that players can spend a lot of time shopping for things and like doing the whole gear porn thing. And while that normally bothers me, I think if I was to do something crunchy, I would want to have that versatility in the equipment as well, so that the equipment didn't just feel like there's a dozen items that are just really slightly reskinned. I'd want them to have slightly different characteristics and things like that to make them kind of stand apart from each other. I would probably expand trauma a little bit, and that includes how crits are handled so that it felt a little bit more dynamic. And I might look at something like Harnmaster or even Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay as well, and do something with hit location and armor on hit location. But that also kind of depends on the genre specifically, because that doesn't make so much sense for more contemporary or science fiction settings, the hit locations and armor per location. But for fantasy and for sort of medieval or maybe even Renaissance, that does make a little bit more sense when there aren't, projectile weapons, ballistic weapons, that sort of thing. So yeah, trauma I would probably expand a little bit. I'd like to have, I think if we're going for something a little bit more tactical, off the top of my head, I would probably, because I don't really like whiff in combat, I would probably look at having some sort of a soak stat, which might be something like hit points or hit protection, as it's called in Into the Odd and Electric Bastion, etc. I like how they do that system. So I might borrow something from, some inspiration from that area, where your hit protection is always going down in a combat. Every time you're involved in a melee with someone, or you're being shot at by someone, your soak is going down. There's nothing that cannot hit you. It's just if you dodge well enough, then you're going to avoid something. So making combat really dangerous would be kind of how I would probably approach it. And then there would be some sort of probably wound system where you can take wounds with certain triggers. And I don't know how I do that, but that's probably what I would do. I'd probably want to have it feel like there's a lot at stake. And I don't think that necessarily comes across when you have a system where you roll to hit and there's a possibility that you miss, or someone's rolling to hit you and you can just dodge out of the way all the time and you never get hit. I like it when there's, you feel like you might have to run because you're going to be hit every single time, and it's just maybe a random dice roll for how much damage you're going to be taking. What else would I do? I mean, there's lots of other little systems I would play around with, and I think that's for now as a sort of theoretical what if. It's very hard for me to just think about what other systems I would put into play, like meta currencies, how I would do pushing. That really depends on how I would build the whole thing. But that's kind of how I would start. Whether I would do, if I was to do anything like this, that almost sound like I'm about to start it. If I was to do this, there would be lots of little tweaks depending on the genre. And I guess the temptation would be to create something like Savage Worlds, where you have a framework in one book with dials that you can, like recommended dials to tweak for specific genres. So that's probably how I would do it if I was to do like a framework. Yeah. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. And now that I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking about my Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay Year Zero engine hack, which is coming up onto my to-do list. And now I'm thinking about hacking into something more crunchy. So thanks, Attila. You might get your answer. It might be just something I do for one of my game projects just to do it and to see how it turns out. And really, I think Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay is a game, like a hack for it is a game that would suit the crunch. I would just be, I don't know, it might not be as crunchy as you would make it, because I know you do like a lot of crunch. So my version of high crunch would definitely be less than, for example, Twilight 2000. It would be a different type of crunch to what Forbidden Lands has, because there's crunch in that system that I would probably do differently if I was to design that game. Yeah, and in fact, I am working on a Forbidden Lands hack, or like an alternate setting, where I am rewriting a lot of the core engine. I mean, not the core. The core is still Forbidden Lands. The skills aren't changing much. How the attributes work and pushing work is more or less exactly the same, but a lot of the kind of nitty gritty stuff around that is being kind of tweaked to how I prefer to do things. Anyway, so that's pretty much how I would do a Year Zero maxi, which I would probably call something else. Let's see, I've got L for light, M for mini, N for nano. So I'd either go with O, or I'd go back on the other side of L, which would be K. Year Zero crunch. Year Zero crunchy with a K, maybe. Yeah, that way, because the nano is the lightest, and it's going back in the letters. M is mini is the next. Then we've got L, which is light, so it would make sense to go with a K. So yeah, Year Zero crunch. Sounds really stupid to my ear. So yeah, if you've got any ideas for what I could call that. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I'd call it Year Zero. I don't know if I'd make a full system out of it. I think, if anything, I would just take one of my projects, like my Wolfra pack, and I would just make a crunchy system for it, which would be loosely inspired by Year Zero Light, like an expanded version of Year Zero Light, and not actually go the route of making a framework for it. I think. Who knows how I'll feel in a month's time, in a week's time. Next project. Hey, I've actually started this. You never know with me. But currently, I've got very specific projects I'm focusing on, and that's not going to change for the foreseeable future. So thank you very much, Attila, for the question, for the thought exercise. And that was my only question for this month. So if any of you Patreon supporters who are watching this have questions you want to ask me, in the first week of every month, a post comes out on Patreon asking for questions. Just drop your question into the comments of that post, and I will review it at the end of the month and make a video like this one. So thanks very much, and catch you next time. Bye-bye.